Okay, with all of that said, let's go ahead and transition to our best picture movie series. We have covered The Apartment and West Side Story, the first two films from the 1960s. We are now on to 1962 with David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
So before we get into it, it's real interesting because, for one, Brendan has technically, officially reviewed this film on the Ancestral Film podcast before.
I think we have to acknowledge that and bring it up because it might make this conversation a little interesting. It might make it a little bit restrictive in a way because I don't want to just regurgitate everything I said 5 years ago. But yeah, you're right. I did review this on the previous Extra Film platform with Jay Ledbetter and Ryan McQuaid when they were doing their David Lean movie series. And of course, when you're talking about David Lean, you have to talk about Lawrence of Arabia. And I joined them for that one.
Yep. It was, to your point, quite a few years ago, though. A lot of people listening may not remember that conversation or your thoughts exactly. I do look forward to getting into this conversation, but I did want to highlight that we have technically covered this film before, but it's been a few years.
Yeah.
I was not a part of that conversation, though. I've never given my full thoughts on Lawrence of Arabia. And I'm glad that we're doing this now because I do have a fascinating history with this film. For whatever reason, don't ask me to articulate why, because I could not tell you. The old me was a dummy. Okay? Let's just get that out there. That's just
there have been a few episodes where you've acknowledged that young JD was maybe a little simple-minded, we'll simply say.
I had a few moments. Let's just put it that way.
We all have, to be fair.
Yeah. I did not love Lawrence of Arabia the first time that I saw it. And again, could not tell you why. And I don't really care to wrestle with that because it doesn't matter anymore. I have come around on Lawrence of Arabia. A couple of rewatches down the road, and boy, have I done a 180 on Lawrence of Arabia. So, however I felt about it all those years ago, it doesn't matter. My thoughts here are going to reflect something very, very different. I look forward to getting into it. I'm glad that we've arrived to this point.
Yeah, this 1960s Best Picture winning series thus far between The Apartment, West Side Story, and now Lawrence of Arabia. Man, this is going downhill fast, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how. Like the Academy, as far as certain runs go, that's as good of a 3-year run as they've ever had. I don't know if they've ever had another 3-year run close to that.
Let's look at this.
I haven't done that research, but
let's look at this a little bit further because we're obviously going to talk about Tom Jones next week, so we can't weigh in on that yet, whether that turns into a 4-year run. But if we look at the year before The Apartment, when Ben-Hur won Best Picture.
That's a good point. That's also a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are still some good movies that Ben-Hur was nominated against back in 1959. But it's a classic film. It's an important film. So the stature of that victory, I think, might make that a 4-year kind of cool run, I guess. It's a pretty good one.
I will say I'm kind of looking ahead, although it's not quite the same because there are some in between that somewhat undercuts the consistency of a direct 4-year run. But the Academy in the 70s, they did pretty well. They did a good job. I'll just say that they did a pretty good job in the 70s.
The difference between the 60s and the 70s, though, like when you look at a year like, I don't know, 1975, for instance, anything could have won Best Picture. It would have been a good win.
That lineup is ridiculous.
Lineup is stupid.
So good.
That lineup is stupid.
So dumb. Yeah. I mean, talk about nailing the nominations. I mean, yeah, incredible.
Yeah, but there There are a few
Yeah.
years in 1975 for that particular decade where I think it almost falls into that kind of situation. Maybe not quite as noticeably as 1975, but heck, I mean, The Godfather Part 2 wins Best Picture the year before that, but some people might prefer The Conversation. Some people might prefer Chinatown. Classic
Yeah,
films, right?
though that's another, like, any of those three could have won, and we wouldn't look at the 70s all that differently
No,
if that was the
no.
case.
I'm with you. Makes it
I
really
do
interesting.
I do wonder what history or how history could have looked, though, if, let's say, The Exorcist won in 1973 instead of The Sting. Man, that
I
would have
think
been
that, yeah,
fascinating.
that
Would have been
would have
fascinating.
that would have made more sense, I think, just given the stature of that film compared to The Sting, which I think is a fun movie, a very
Could
fun
you
movie. I like The
imagine
Sting.
if we went from Patton to The French Connection to The Godfather to The Exorcist to The Godfather Part 2 to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to Rocky to Annie Hall? I mean, good lord. Okay.
That's
Okay.
especially when you look at what movies would normally win Best Picture in the 2000s and maybe 1990s, just in general. That's like the
Mhm.
70s that's kind of rude. It's kind of rude.
It is. And I will say, like, we give the Academy a hard time. I do think, the transition from the 70s to the 90s and through the early 2000s,
Mhm.
it wasn't always great. It
No,
wasn't always great. And even like the late 2000s, early 2010s, there were some big misses, I think.
sure.
But, and we've talked about this a lot over the last few years, so I don't have to hammer the point home. But I do think where the Academy is going now, it feels kind of reminiscent of the quality we got in the 70s, which is exciting.
The kind of films that they seem to be honoring, if it's the big film from that particular year, it seems to be the right one. If it's
Mhm.
a smaller film, it also seems to be the right one. So yeah,
Mhm.
I think you're not wrong in that analysis there. It does seem to be somewhat comparable to what we saw in previous decades for sure.
Yeah. And look, I know I'm getting into a rabbit hole on the 70s because, good Lord, that decade is incredible. But the
Yeah.
60s has some great films, which is why we're here. And I'm very
Yeah.
excited to get to the rest of this decade and Lawrence of Arabia. That's where we are now. 1962. Let's go ahead and dig into this all-time classic. As you noted, Brendan, it is directed by one David Lean. Man, good at his job. We'll say that.
Yeah.
It stars one Peter O'Toole, as well as Alec Guinness, Anthony Quinn, Jack Hawkins, Claude Rains, Omar Sharif, and a bunch of others. A bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. You are absolutely familiar with Lawrence of Arabia. But to reiterate, it tells the story of one T.E. Lawrence, the English officer who successfully united and led the diverse, often warring Arab tribes during World War I in order to fight the Turks. All right, Brendan, let's jump into it. What did you think about
Yeah.
Lawrence of Arabia?
So when I reviewed this back with Jay and Rhyme 5 years ago, I acknowledged that it was a first time watch for me back then. So 5 years ago, I finally caught up with this one, and it's interesting to see it in that way for how influential the film was. I mean, there's nothing we can really say about this film that hasn't already been said. I think the most interesting way to phrase it, at least the most interesting way that I can come up with it, is that if you haven't seen Lawrence of Arabia yet, you've seen Lawrence of Arabia. You have. Whether you've seen the movie itself, you've seen Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, you've seen Indiana Jones, you've kind of seen Lawrence of Arabia. Even Steven Spielberg himself has acknowledged that this is his favorite movie. And the first half of Lawrence of Arabia is very reminiscent of an Indiana Jones like adventure. I mean, so much of the first half of this movie went on to essentially create every desert adventure movie ever made afterwards.
Yeah.
So there's so much of that in there. I mean, basically what Spielberg would do was take the sophistication of Lawrence of Arabia and fuse it with those old serials that were the basis of an Indiana Jones-like adventure, and that was the creation of Raiders of the Lost Ark. So whether you've seen Lawrence of Arabia or not, you've kind of seen it. And an even bigger example, if you've seen Dune, you have absolutely seen Lawrence of Arabia.
Yep. 100%.
I mean,
100%.
Of course, Dune has existed for a long time, tracing all the way back to Frank Herbert's original novel. And then, of course, David Lynch's notorious adaptation in the early 80s. But specifically, if you've seen Denis Villeneuve's films, Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, together, that is absolutely Lawrence of Arabia. It's the same
and
art.
Especially when we get to Dune Messiah, how that parallels the second half of Lawrence of Arabia. Yeah, the parallels are striking between those two stories for sure.
They absolutely are, which is why something we said just a few weeks ago, JD, when we talked about The Apartment, the Billy Wilder film, I called that one of the best tale of two halves movies that we've perhaps ever talked about on the show. We probably should have saved that distinction for Lawrence of Arabia because this is the most literal tale of two halves movie I can think of where it absolutely earns that distinction, where each half, split by a very appropriate intermission, kind of functions as two separate movies in a way. It makes for a complete arc and a complete journey. And it's so interesting that someone like David Lean was able to create something like this when much of his films before this were very, I guess, domestic by comparison. His previous masterpiece was Brief Encounter, which is completely antithetical to a movie like this.
Yeah, but a masterpiece on its own. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you can't even really compare the two. You really can't.
No, you can't.
Yeah, but Lawrence of Arabia, it's a great movie. It's an absolutely great movie. And I think what makes it great and what surprised me most about it when I first saw it 5 years ago is the way it kind of tricked me. And I wonder if it tricked audiences the same way when it first came out in 1962, which was promising you this epic desert adventure, which it does give you until it doesn't. And I was not ready for that when I first saw the film. And I kind of loved that ignorant experience I had with it because the psychology of T.E. Lawrence himself, I think, is the most fascinating thing about this movie and why I think it has so much staying power on top of just the filmmaking prowess that it is. So yeah, great movie. Rightful Best Picture winner, I think.
Yeah, this is one of the best films of all time. It is truly an astounding cinematic achievement. It is big, it's vast, it's epic in every sense of the word. The cinematography, I don't know what to say about it that hasn't been said already. To your point, Brendan, it is breathtaking. It is truly, and I know we mentioned this earlier on the show, but it truly is one of the best shot films ever made. The desert imagery is sensational, truly awe-inducing. But I also love the production design we see in Cairo and Jerusalem. Those scenes are wonderfully crafted. Everything is large in scope. But for all of its technical merit, it's also one of the best character studies ever put to film. Lawrence's rise to prominence, only for him to lose his identity and become claimed by the desert as he succumbs to his savior complex, is just as extraordinary as the filmmaking. Lawrence rejects where he comes from. He sees himself as a savior to the Arab people, a belief that fuels his ambitions and hubris. He relishes in the role of the hero and even adopts the Arab garb. However, that ethos is what becomes his downfall as he increasingly becomes detached from reality, and his ideals clash when the British Empire war with the fractured Arab tribes. And what we see is a man whose desire to save the Arabs blind him from the complexities of politics on both sides and the limits of his own influence. And in the end, he is left disillusioned and psychologically scarred. This film is a captivating critique of the savior complex, not only showing us the broader dangers of intervening under the guise of salvation, but more poignantly demonstrating the individual costs that come as a side effect. It is truly one of the most sophisticated films ever made from a storytelling perspective, which is wild because I feel like that is always secondary to its filmmaking craft. You bring up Lawrence of Arabia, a lot of the time people want to talk about its achievements in terms of its legacy, in terms of what it was able to pull off in the desert. And I totally understand that. The cinematography, the editing, the craft here, it truly is mesmerizing. And I think you could flip those conversations and its legacy is the exact same because the nuances, the psychological nuances and textures here are just as riveting and just as layered. And not enough can be said about Peter O'Toole's performance. It is phenomenal what he does here. I'm sure we'll talk more about it as we go. It is incredible. But yes, I agree with everything you said. One of the best films ever made, hands down.
Yeah, it's Dune. He's Paul Atreides. He absolutely is. And it's actually kind of insane how similar that these movies are, these stories are. It just not even in the characterization of T.E. Lawrence himself and how similar it is to Paul Atreides. It's just the narrative trajectory that these stories go on. They are very similar. I just find it so wild how this film functions as this tale of two halves when both halves really do feel like completely different experiences. So on one hand, with that first half, you do remember the scope of this movie, and rightfully so. That's where the vibrancy is most important. That's where the filmmaking is most important. It's giving you this this adventure tale essentially, only for it to then deconstruct that in a very horrific way. The back half can be a little bit messier, but it's rightfully messy as it gets into the messy politics of how T.E. Lawrence is essentially torn between these two sides, and then tragically so when he realizes how much of a pawn he was for the British army, and without really ever realizing it. And I think that's where the sadness of this story is most affecting, and why I love Peter O'Toole's performance so much, is how this really just functions as a tale about a man who really didn't belong anywhere. And his journey to try to belong somewhere just led him even more disassociated from that journey as he tried harder and harder with that, especially when that savior complex that you're talking about becomes more apparent. I think that is so it's harrowing. It's really harrowing stuff. Peter O'Toole plays it in that back half kind of like a horror villain in some ways. There are some truly frightening sequences there that I don't know of anyone else that could have pulled this off. And this was a very early role for him. I don't recall if this was his first ever film role. At the very least, it was his first ever starring role. And I think he may have been only 27 at the time that this came out. Absolutely crazy. Wild of a star-making performance for sure. And of course, would not go on to win the Oscar this year. But I don't know. I can't really say too much bad about that because I do love Gregory Peck's performance in To Kill a Mockingbird as well.
Sure, same.
I don't know if it's better, but I just love that movie. But at the same time, I can't disregard or at least ignore that this is the more challenging performance. This is the more challenging movie for sure.
I agree. And I think that's what struck me the most on this rewatch, because again, the cinematography, the craft of the film, it is excellent. Yeah. It has been essayed to death. And I don't know if I have really much more to add other than the imagery as not just a mechanism for the visual language of the film, but how it complements the storytelling. It is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And the first time you watch the film, that will stand out. No doubt about it.
Yeah.
On this rewatch, I think because I knew what I was getting into, I really wanted to focus on Peter O'Toole's performance and the characterization of Lawrence. And it really did strike me, the sophistication of this film, as I mentioned earlier. And I love how the film deconstructs him as we go, beginning with, emulating how, in those opening scenes, how he is this idealist. He's this intellectual. He is defined by his belief of mind over matter, There's a couple of tricks he pulls off regarding these matches and putting them out with his fingers.
Match cut. That match cut.
Yeah.
Quite literally a match cut.
Quite literally, yeah. One of the characters going, yeah, but it hurts. And he just says the trick is not minding that it hurts. And that is important because he doesn't see the desert as the largest landscape that it is. He sees it as something to extinguish. And it does come easy for him at first. Those sequences with his guide are endearing, and Lawrence is able to build a trust with him. But things change quickly once they get to the well, and he realizes that there are laws and principles in the desert that he was ignorant to. And as a result, his guide is killed when he goes for the gun that Lawrence had gifted him in earnest. It's a bit of irony that also works as extraordinary foreshadowing. That moment is also fascinating because, as we learn, Lawrence has an interesting relationship with death and fate. He doesn't like killing and bloodshed. In fact, as his guide is murdered, what he says there is, none of my friends are murderers, which is why he doesn't go off there with Ali. And he's a man of compassion and mercy. That's what we see early on, which is particularly highlighted by his empathy toward the two orphan kids that want to serve him.
Yeah.
But there's the memorable scene of him going back into the desert to find Gassim, who had fallen off his camel and who would have died without Lawrence's heroic actions. The film then goes on to, of course, deconstruct that as his savior complex begins to manifest itself, and he becomes the image of barbarity that he once condemned, even admitting in one scene that he kind of enjoyed.
I was gonna bring that up. Yeah, this is a man that did not, he had no experience in killing. So when he finally had the experience, it was almost like this weird awakening for him. This de-evolution of sorts.
I agree, and you couple that with this perspective of Lawrence tempting death and the risk that he takes, such as crossing the Nefud Desert in the first half of the film, or with how he leads his men recklessly into battle in the second half. He's not directly killing by making those decisions, but it says something about him that he's willing to tempt fate in that way. He sees himself as some sort of miracle worker who can do the impossible. And it's because he doesn't see fate as something that is written. There's this final debate right before he goes out to save Gassim, where he argues that nothing is written. You can write your own fate, something that once again offers incredible irony as the story unfolds, given what we see with Gassim. But it makes sense of his choices throughout the film. I love how the film explores that relationship with death and fate, and how there is a twist on that with Lawrence throughout the film. And the juxtaposition of him as some sort of savior and what that is supposed to mean, what that literally means, yet every action he takes undermines that very definition.
Yeah, like the fact that he was really shaping his own destiny, but what he ended up shaping it into was maybe not what he ever had in mind. And there's a lot of irony to that whole statement that nothing is written. So he's not wrong, but he's also not really right either. He had control over it until he didn't have control over it. And I think that's what makes his arc so fascinating, because it's certainly deconstructing the whole savior complex that you're talking about, that many movies are guilty of portraying, perhaps wrongfully. But the film also does a great job deconstructing audience expectations. And I don't know if this was on David Lean's mind when he was making the film. It may have been, because from what I understand, T.E. Lawrence's real life brother, I think, was alive during the production of this movie and actually didn't approve of the direction this movie was going in. So David Lean,
I can't imagine why.
I know, right? So David Lean clearly knew where he wanted to take this story and the arc he had in mind for T.E. Lawrence. But I do wonder if he also had it in his mind to play with audience expectations, because we're introduced to T.E. Lawrence in the beginning, and some of his trademark traits are not really ever forgotten or lost throughout the duration of this movie. He's very arrogant, he's very reckless, sometimes to a fault, but at first, as an audience member, you're kind of charmed by that arrogance because it's very playful in a way that you just find endearing and you want to watch. But then when you get to that second half, he still maintains some of that arrogance, but it just has a very different aura this time around. And as an audience member, you're kind of sitting there thinking, man, I was cheering this on just 3 hours ago. What happened?
Yeah.
And it plays with audience expectations as well. And I do wonder if that was on David Lean's mind, but it's certainly there in Peter O'Toole's performance.
I completely agree, but I do think there's a lot of purpose and intention to how David Lean deconstructs that in Lawrence, particularly as it relates to mind over matter, how that is established in the character, as we were talking about a moment ago. And it's interesting how fate and death connect to Lawrence's ethos of mind over matter. His decision to cross the Nefu Desert is almost entirely based on that idea. And the success of finding Gasm, while it reaffirms his belief that his mind can overcome fate, that actually becomes a mechanism for his downfall, because now he thinks he can tame the desert. But fate has a trick up its sleeve when Lawrence commits to being a mediator between two Arab tribes, and one man kills another, and then he is forced to execute the murderer of one of the tribes. And who does that end up being? It ends up being Gasm, the man he saved in the desert. So as much as he thought he could overcome fate, it turns out the desert is not that easy. And if that wasn't enough, later on in the film, as we noted earlier, he admits to enjoying that execution, which at that point, he's in full identity crisis mode, where he likes what he hates and hates that he likes it, meaning that he's lost all control over mind over matter. The psychological nuances of Lawrence there is nothing short of sublime. And I also love how all of that is symbolically depicted when he shows back up in Cairo, not in his British uniform, but in a completely new garb that makes him unrecognizable to his colleagues and commanders. Again, the storytelling and the visual language of the film.
Oh yeah, they mistaken him for an Arab at one point.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I love that about this film. That idea of mind over matter, how that becomes the nucleus of his choices, how he thinks he has one up on the desert, only for the desert to remind him, no, I'm the one in control here.
Well, yeah.
And you don't have the strength. You think that you do, but you don't. And how that breaks him very literally.
Well, yeah.
At one point in the back half of the film is incredible.
Yeah. And by that point, nothing he's doing is at the service of the British government anymore, or even really the Allied powers at large. The British government and the Arabs being allies in this example against the Central Powers, which include the Ottoman Empire or the Turks in this case. Nothing is at the service of what they're asking of him. It's all at the service of his desire to tame the desert, as you say, because at some point by the end of the film, it becomes kind of this competition between two allied powers because of T.E. Lawrence's efforts. Really, like the whole journey of trying to overtake Damascus, I believe it is, becomes this race between both the Arabs and the Brits, who are supposed to be allies in this case, which I think also plays into some of the fragmented politics of World War I, which I think is a really interesting idea, that even though they are technically allies, that still doesn't mean that the culture that's technically more strong by numbers is going to look at this next nation as someone that they see as their equal. So there is still this kind of cultural ignorance at play here, even despite the fact that they are part of the same team. So there is that conversation to be had as well. But everything that T.E. Lawrence is doing here is for the betterment of his own ego, essentially. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating as well because initially, I do think his idealism comes from a sincere place.
At first, yeah.
And how the desert begins to break him. Again, the irony of mind over matter, I think, is interesting. And then to your point, as we see the film deconstruct him further, you enter in the Bentley character, this American journalist, and what does he want to do? He wants to play on that ego even further because he wants to turn Lawrence into a myth. And when Bentley is around,
that's the thing that has aged the best about this movie is probably that character.
Yeah, and when Bentley is around, it's almost as if Lawrence is untouchable. You think about the train sequence, especially.
He's almost posing for the camera at that point.
Yes, he is. They blow up the train. One Turk has several clear shots at Lawrence that never hit him, but he doesn't move. He just stands there. He even says brazenly that they could only kill him with a quote unquote golden bullet. He begins to believe in the myth himself, which is perhaps most quintessential when he proposes to attack the Turkish city of Daraa with just a handful of Arab soldiers. It's another crossroad of mind versus fate, as Ali argues once again that it's suicide, to which Lawrence says, "What do you know about what can be done?" And he believes that he can walk on water because he's pulled off miracles before, but he becomes so out of touch with reality and steeped in illusion that he thinks he can pass as an Arab as he myopically walks out in the open in Turkish occupied territory. I'm invisible, I believe is what he says.
He even pretends to walk on water, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and he literally pretends to walk on water. And boy, does that illusion come down to earth quickly when he is captured and tortured.
Pretty much instantaneously. He's not even able to make it like 5 feet until it's like, oh, who is this guy?
Does not get very far. Does not get very far at all. And at that point, he's no longer a myth. He's no longer a savior. He's just a pile of flesh and bone. And he is broken of mind and spirit. And again, like that whole series of events, I just find is so incredible in this movie. It's so good.
It's deeply cynical, and I find that really interesting for a film that came out in 1962. But it never loses its emotional core, which is really good about it. I think if it weren't for one particular thing, this movie may have ended up becoming too cynical for its own good. But thankfully, we still have a performance from Omar Sharif playing Sharif Ali, who maintains that emotional core that's necessary for this film to have really its rewatchability. Otherwise, it would just be too bitter, I feel like. And I think he's able to balance the de-evolution that T.E. Lawrence is going through. And I think that makes that performance so crucial as well. Also nominated for an Oscar, if I'm not mistaken, for this movie. Did he end up winning? I don't have the list of 7 Oscars this movie won in front of me. Let me pull that up quickly. But because it obviously won Best Picture. No, Omar Sharif was only nominated, but did not win Best Supporting Actor for this. But that's unfortunate because I think in many ways he's sort of the emotional core, or at least he's the one that sustains the emotional core for this movie.
No, yeah, he's really great. And you need a character like that to understand the extremes of where Lawrence
to balance things out. Yeah.
To balance things out, because not only does he understand the political nuances of the region more, he understands the physical costs of going into battle or crossing the desert more than Lawrence does. And I think through that juxtaposition, you really come to realize, and maybe this is a bit ironic or perhaps even funny, given that debate of fate versus death, how you write your own fate. I think the Ali character serves a great purpose, not just emotionally, but I think we do come to understand that the savior complex that manifests in Lawrence, I think so much of it is by sheer luck.
Luck. I don't disagree. I don't disagree. There's a lot that's a lucky accident.
That's a lucky accident, but because those things happen, and maybe that is Lawrence's point after all, is that he's able to create his own luck. That could be part of it. But I think the grounded pragmatism of Ali does demonstrate that a lot of what happens to Lawrence, especially when you go back to that moment, the train sequence we just mentioned a moment ago, he is just standing there as a Turkish soldier is just shooting at him. And he doesn't get hit. He's just standing there. That, again, is the luck factor at play. Any one of those bullets could have struck him. Movie's over. You know?
It is.
So, like,
yeah.
it's
so
one
arrogant,
of those things
so
where
bitter. Wow, I love that.
He's so extreme, like he's so disillusioned, and you need a character like Ali that brings everything down to earth. And I think that does give weight to those scenes when he is being tortured, and even it's inferred that he was perhaps raped in those scenes as well. And it gives understanding to why Lawrence becomes as broken as he does and decides to go back to Jerusalem, to British occupied Jerusalem. And when we see him there, he's no longer in his Arab garb. He's back in his British uniform.
Even though it's
borrowed one.
Yeah, a borrowed one. I was just going to say it's not his, but it is. You know, he is still kind of playing the part, if you will, which is why I said earlier, this is a man that really belonged nowhere in many ways. He was kind of this loner, and I think that seniority complex that we keep alluding to really does come from this need to belong somewhere. And this is someone that just given his participation, given his belief system, he really didn't belong in either world that's at play here. And I find that devastating, but I also find it frightening and so bitter the way that he handles it. And I don't know what Peter O'Toole's able to do with his eyes, because he's able to look at straight at the it's all in the eyes, right? He's able to look straight in the camera in that first half, and you are charmed by it. And then he's able to do the exact same thing, and somehow you have nightmares from it in the second half.
Yeah.
I don't know what he does.
Well, and that's the incredible thing about his performance. And I wholly agree with you. Those early scenes, the idealism that he offers to the character, it comes off genuine because of his performance, how he's able to deliver those lines of dialogue, to her point, the way he's able to, with his eye work, with his facial mannerisms, you do believe him. And then through the middle sections of the film, you see him become lost because his identity, has become fractured. And then you get to the third act of the film where there is no ambiguity anymore. Lawrence becomes fully indulgent in his bloodlust. All of his idealism, all of his idealist foundations have evaporated. The desert has completely claimed his mind and body, and he wholly gives into the joy of killing and showing no mercy, crystallizing in a moment. And I love this, again, going back to the visual storytelling of the film, it crystallizes in this moment of Lawrence covered in sand and blood, looking at the reflection on the knife that he was giving, a fascinating shot that juxtaposes one earlier in the film when he was first given those robes and that knife. It's an incredible inverse there, which is to say, you cannot tame the desert. You cannot become the savior of something that was never yours to begin with. The ideal Lawrence is completely gone at that point, other than the myth that exists outside of him, which is why this story has the epic quality it does, because he lives on as a myth.
He does, yeah.
And I love how that plays into the film here.
Yeah, and it's also why the cinematography is so important in emphasizing the vastness of the desert and how untamable that it is, to your point. And as we're talking about here, cinematography by Freddie Young. we have to highlight the individual there, just given how beautiful that this film is and how vast and wide and huge that everything is. It makes it feel very uninhabitable, essentially. Not just untamable, it's uninhabitable. It feels like another planet. It feels like Arrakis is basically what this feels like.
It does.
It's spicing things up quite literally. But it's we'll probably talk about some individual shots that we love, just in keeping with the theme of this entire episode. But the overall cinematography, I think, definitely has a purpose in emphasizing the bigness and how untamable that it ultimately is.
Yeah, and also shout out to Ann Coates, the editor of this film, because this is a film that is 220 minutes long. It is not a short film by any stretch of the imagination, but it is endlessly fascinating. There is never a banal moment here. And I think her editing, coupled with Freddie Young's cinematography, the writing of the film, the performances, everything we've been talking about, it is an incredibly seamless experience.
If you do plan on watching this movie and you haven't seen it before, I don't recommend watching it on Max. It's available for streaming on Max right now, and I'm not sure how you watched it, JD, at least for the purposes of this particular episode, but the version on Max that I revisited did not include the intermission, nor did it include the opening overture, which I think is so crucial to the overall pacing of this movie and why it works in totality. And I wanted to bring that up because you're talking about the editing. I think Ann Coates' work does play a part into how the film is structured and where those overtures and intermissions are ultimately placed. I think that is very important.
Yeah. It is interesting you bring that up because that is also how I watched this movie. Now, thankfully, I had seen it before. So when we got to that element of the film and I noticed that it was gone, I was like, what the hell is going on here?
I was the same way.
I was so confused at first. But if you've seen the film, you'll notice it immediately. And those elements missing here are vital. I agree. Yeah. That was a bit weird. Thankfully, I had seen the film before, so it didn't really disrupt my experience a whole lot. But
yeah, same.
Yeah, that is a good point. If you've never seen it, be aware that if you go to watch this on Max, you're not going to get the whole thing.
Yeah.
And you should go seek out the whole thing.
You should get the whole thing. You absolutely need the whole thing.
I do want to point out as we wind down this conversation, the marriage of storytelling and visual, in the visual language of the film. That sequence when he goes back to Jerusalem after being tortured. And we noted earlier that he's back in his British uniform. As that sequence plays out, there comes a moment when Lawrence learns of the Sykes-Picot agreement. And his reaction to that is interesting because it's like the British have reopened his wounds. He feels betrayed when he finds that out. Yeah. And I love how the film visually depicts that by showing us that his wounds on his back have literally reopened and he's bleeding through his uniform. Yeah. So again, an incredible moment of symbolism there that I did not notice the first time around, but definitely saw it on this second watch.
Very appropriate.
Which I thought was incredible. And I think that's the beauty of this film, especially at 222 minutes. You're not going to catch everything the first time around, the second time, or the third time. Like, the more you rewatch this, the more you're going to get out of it, which is why it's so breathtaking. And
absolutely, it's also a very well written film too. Watching it again, I almost found myself jotting down quotes from the movie because I just thought it was so poetically written. Robert Bolt and Michael Wilson, co-writers on this movie, really great stuff there as far as their interpretation of this story and just the poetry of it as well. I think is really great.
I found this incredibly poetic. I mean, going back to my opening thoughts on this film in this conversation, I find the craft of this film as striking as everyone else does. But on this specific revisit, I found so much in the writing and in the deconstruction of Lawrence as we're talking about. And as we noted earlier, this savior complex isn't anything new by any stretch of the imagination, but the way it's executed here, I think there's a level of sophistication that's just as extraordinary as the filmmaking. It is incredible, the use of symbolism, the dialogue itself, and how the film goes about deconstructing Lawrence in all the ways that we've talked about in this conversation. I find it tantalizing. I was just as engaged, if not more engaged, with
I
the
was too.
drama, the storytelling, the characterization of Lawrence. And you're right. I mean, it does get a bit cynical in the end. It is a tragedy after all. And I find that fascinating. Like, I find that really, really compelling. In fact, I think there's so much nuance and texture here. There's a lot more the film could have gone into, and I think wonderfully concise, made everything concise for, so there's not
a
much
weird
fat on
word
this
a
film.
weird word to use for a movie that's almost 5 hours long is to say it's
I know.
concise, but it is. You're right. There's no wasted space.
And the reason I say that, going back to your Dune comparison, because I think if you were going to remake this film today, I think you could do it in 3 parts, similar to Dune. I think there's so much in terms of the politics, like the context of the setting here, World War I. This film doesn't get into that a whole lot. And when it does, it's in small bursts, small bits in between.
It gives you enough to understand the psychology of the politics, but not the politics of the politics, if that makes sense. It's less interested in that.
I completely agree, which is to say, if you wanted to tell this in 3 parts like Denis Villeneuve is doing with Dune, there is enough material here to do that.
Sure.
Because this film leaves out a lot.
Yeah.
Leaves out a lot. There's so much more context you could get into. You could extend sequences that further unravel the psychology of Lawrence. You could extend certain battle scenes, allow more scenes to breathe or to shape into something a little different. There is room to do that here. And I would find that utterly engrossing. But that's why, in addition to the cinematography, I wanted to highlight Ann Coates, because she takes what could have been 3 movies and she condensed it into,
and it somehow makes sense.
222 minutes. And it's very seamless and it makes sense.
Yeah.
So like it's an incredible piece of art. Short of it, that's it.
It's one of the best picture winners of all time. I think many people would agree with that. I think it's, this series is on a roll so far. We talked about The Apartment, West Side Story, and now this. All 3 are bangers in their own way. All 3 are bangers. I think Lawrence of Arabia is certainly the best, maybe the most important, to say the least. I do love The Apartment. That might be the one I slightly prefer, as just more of a Brendan pick, if that makes sense. But Lawrence of Arabia is Lawrence of Arabia. There's nothing that compares to it. It's in a way, like, as far as movies are concerned, it's basically Jesus in a way. It's the best way I could describe it.
Yeah, I mean, Lawrence of Arabia, spoiler alert, will be the best of the 60s that we cover, unless I'm blown away by Tom Jones. I haven't seen it, but who knows? Maybe I'll be
I haven't
blown
seen
away.
it either. I haven't seen it either. Some of these I haven't seen in a long time, like The Sound of Music or In the Heat of the Night. Midnight Cowboy, I remember loving quite a bit. So I don't think that'll give Lawrence of Arabia a run for its money. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the day, both Lawrence of Arabia and The Apartment are my numbers 1 and number 2 respectively when it comes to this.
And I said that a few weeks ago when we reviewed The Apartment. I think those would be my 2, and I still stick to that unless I am surprised. Those will be my 2 when we get done with the 1960s. But I love West Side Story. That's very much up there. Midnight Cowboy, I absolutely love as well. And I'll be happy to revisit In the Heat of the Night. It's been quite a long time. Sound of Music, same thing. Haven't seen that in a while. So I am still excited to see where the rest of this goes. And I haven't done the exercise yet, but I'll bring it up here as a simple talking point. It might be the best of the 2 decades that we've decided to cover so far. in the series.
Oh,
Lawrence
between
of
the
Arabia.
40s and the 60s. Yeah, let me
Yeah.
double check that.
Casablanca is my number one of the 40s.
Same.
So it would come down to Casablanca and Lawrence of Arabia as far as my favorite of the series so far that we've covered.
Yeah.
They're both great
yeah.
though. They're both really, really great.
And now we're just splitting masterful hairs here.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
flip a coin, I guess. But
So for
that's
now
kind of
now
where
for
I'm
the
at, though.
now for the year 1962, have you seen the 5 movies nominated for Best Picture, including Lawrence of Arabia, or did you still have some blind spots there?
Haven't seen them all. So To Kill a
Okay.
Mockingbird, of course. I have seen The Longest Day, although it's been the longest day since I've seen that film.
Nice one.
The other two, I believe, are blind spots for me.
I'm the same way as you. Those are the same 3 that I've seen. I do love To Kill a Mockingbird. That has always been one of my favorite films. I can't say it's
Yep.
I can't say it's better than Lawrence of Arabia, even if it might be the one that perhaps moves me more as a piece of as a piece of storytelling, if that makes sense. It's just something it's a story I've always had a close relationship with, just given the fact that I've always loved the book. So I've always loved the story in general. But Lawrence of Arabia is the better movie. And even if I did, at the end of the day, prefer To Kill a Mockingbird, I still think the Academy got it right. A movie like Lawrence of Arabia needs to have this type of reputation because it needs to serve a point. It needs to serve this type of historical purpose.
Yeah, and nothing against To Kill a Mockingbird. I love it as well. I feel like if that film came out in the 80s, it easily would have won. But I'm excited that for all of its progressive values, and I really love To Kill a Mockingbird, I do love that the Academy awarded the Oppenheimer of its time.
Oh, it's a much
You know what I
bolder
mean?
movie as well. Yeah, like To Kill a Mockingbird is the simpler version of something that could be more complex. But yeah, you're right. This was the Oppenheimer of its year for sure.
Yes.
It's a great way to put it, actually.
I love that they stuck to their convictions in that way. And look, I wouldn't have I wouldn't have cared if To Kill a Mockingbird won Best Picture. It is really great, but I do think the Academy got it right between those two.
Yeah.
And the 5 in total.
Have you seen most of David Lean's directorial efforts?
No, there's some blind spots there.
I have
for
quite a
sure.
few blind
I've seen
spots of
all
it.
the big ones. So like Brief Encounter, Great Expectations, The Bridge on the River Kwai, I actually watched last year on my cruise for some reason. I don't know.
That's
why.
a very interesting choice for a cruise ride.
I know. I don't know why. It just was right there. I downloaded it and watched it on the cruise.
Okay.
Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. A Passage of to India I have not seen, but after Ryan and Jay's conversation, I don't know if I should stay away or if it made me more
I'm kind
intrigued.
of curious on it now. I mean, like, it kind of
Yeah.
gets back into maybe like the Alec Guinness conversation we haven't had yet on Lawrence of Arabia, and maybe
yes,
yeah.
that is a good point. The one criticism you will have of Lawrence of Arabia, and it's similar to what we talked about last week with West Side Story. And it's, look, I'm not excusing it. It's, you can't overlook it. It is a problem, but it was a problem of the time.
It was more it was more of a problem with historical epics, and it seems to sometimes still be a problem with historical epics. I don't know if it's just due to the circumstances with how those movies are made that we see that happen more often. So I don't know, but it is it is certainly a problem. It is admittedly a bit distracting because I also feel like Alec Guinness is kind of channeling his early Obi-Wan Kenobi isms.
There is
with
a little bit of that in his performance.
Because Alec Guinness is a versatile actor. I mean, he has a part in The Bridge on the River Kwai, and it's a very different performance. He's also very funny in the Lady Killers as well. But here, like, I got a lot of Kenobi out of him here, and it was admittedly a bit distracting, which is not really the film's fault or even Alec Guinness's fault. It's more of an, it's our fault, honestly.
Wasn't that partially why he was cast?
I think
Obi-Wan?
so. I think so. Yeah.
This role, I think, had a big influence on Lucas, if I'm not mistaken.
I would not have been surprised, especially given that Tatooine is kind of another mirror image of Arabia here in some ways. So there's definitely an influence happening there. There are a lot of long movies from this era. I mean, like Lawrence of Arabia really started to set some type of trend, not just with movies in general, but even David Lean kept trying to recreate the success of Lawrence of Arabia with movies like Dr. Zhivago or Ryan's Daughter or A Passage to India. And
Yeah.
from what I understand, some of these movies I haven't seen. I have seen Dr. Zhivago, and I actually quite like that film from what I remember. But some of these other ones, from what I understand, he was just not able to replicate that success.
Yeah. I mean, Zhivago holds a great reputation,
I like that
at least
movie.
among
Yeah.
critics and cinephiles.
I like that one
it's
quite a bit
still-
from what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. It is interesting. I'm curious if Oppenheimer sets a trend through the rest of the 2020s,
Maybe.
or maybe
Yeah.
not. Who knows? Maybe that'll be a one-off.
I don't know. I don't know, but we'll see.
I
We'll
mean,
see if
audiences
yeah.
of the 60s were built different. They could handle 3-hour epics. Today's culture, no chance. The fact
Yeah.
that Oppenheimer garnered $1 billion is a goddamn miracle,
Will-
for being
will-
honest.
Yeah, well, Lawrence of Arabia also did fairly well at the box office at its time too, from what I understand. I think adjusted for inflation, I guess it equates to like 600 million or something like that. It actually did back in the day, which is not too bad for a movie like this. So we'll see if Oppenheimer ends up being more of the Lawrence of Arabia of our time instead of something like Dune, which would
Yeah.
be really funny.
I know, crazy. That is wild about Dr. Zhivago. It budget $11 million and then went on to make hundreds of millions of dollars. That's insane. Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. At any rate, Lawrence of Arabia, masterpiece, one of the best films of all time, let
Good
alone
movie.
Best Picture winners. We do love it. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment on social media. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify,